Hi, my name's Steve, and this is Little Plastic People. In today's video, we're going to be revisiting armour panel painting. We're going to be taking a look at how I experiment with some red armour panels for a recent night project. But for this one, I'm going to be leaving in a lot more of the experimentation and decision making all the way through. This is just to demonstrate that you don't necessarily need a fixed recipe. Sometimes all you need is just a rough idea of what you want to do. And experimenting and adapting part way through is all part of the process. At least it is for me. So, let's get to the video. First off, I've given everything a coat of black primer, before then picking up some dark purple from AK for the shadow and the starting point, specifically violet red. I do this to provide some colour to the shadows and the dark areas, as I find pure black to be a little bit boring. So into the airbrush it goes, and after a quick mix with a pipette I give the piece a solid coat, making sure to catch all the areas which will end up being left in the shadow. Next up is our first red. This is deep red, again from AK. I've picked this particular red as it's very strong and the coverage from AK is very opaque, reducing the need for me to go back with too many additional coats, even after being thinned. Plus it goes through the airbrush really well. I apply the deep red in a standard zenithal direction from top down, attempting to emulate light coming directly from above the piece. And after a couple of coats and a quick blast with the wife's hairdryer, I start thinking about the next stage. I grab some scarlet red, again from AK, and I use it through the airbrush in the same zenithal application to reinforce the deep red that we already have, but focusing more on the very highest areas. I'm now happy with the basic transition and decide to start building up some texture. So out comes some sponge and a little deep orange, once again from AK. I apply this pretty liberally all over the panel, using the back of my hand and my glove to remove any excess paint from the sponge. Using a sponge here instead of dry brushing not only catches the raised details, but also provides some nice random texture to the flat areas. After a few light passes, I have a pretty consistent transition with some interesting texture, but I'm still not happy with the contrast, particularly around the details. So I grab some volcanic yellow and rework the area, focusing on picking up all of the raised areas and sharp details, still keeping in mind the zenithal light direction we've previously established. Feeling like I could push the contrast just that little bit more, I pick up some white and do the same again. Now normally I avoid using pure white, as it can desaturate things a bit, but I have a solution for this in mind which we'll get to shortly. As suspected, the white has blown things out a little bit, but has provided some nice edge highlighting. So while I decide to fix this, I add some texture to the shadows and darker areas with a little Luxion purple contrast paint applied with a sponge, focusing on the darker areas towards the bottom of the panel. Right, now it's time to bring everything back to read more as a saturated red. I grab a few translucent reds from the shelf, including contrast and watercolour paints, both of which have pretty dense pigment levels and can be thinned way down without breaking apart. This allows me to mix up a tint that will leave the texture in place but bring everything back up to a more saturated red. I initially decide on Bile red and thin it down directly in the airbrush with a little water, but after a first coat I decide to dump this out and switch to a translucent red from Watercolours. I found the translucent range from Watercolours to be great for this kind of work, as their gel medium allows for lots of thinning without the paint breaking down, but it still retains a nice pigment density. With a coat of this applied top down, focusing on the lighter areas, and a quick dry, I go back, mixing in a little Bile red just to catch the very top edges. Now happy with the saturation, I want to bring back a little of the subtle texture and highlights. So it's back to the sponge and deep orange from before, very much focusing on picking out the highest points, trying to keep things relatively subtle. And after a couple of further rounds of going back and forth between the orange texture and the red tinting, I'm happy enough to move forwards with some weathering. So I give the panel a quick coat of gloss varnish to protect the work that we've already done and lower the surface tension, which should help the washes sit and stay in the recessed details. Once this is completely dry, I grab some of my purple ink mix, aka a secret sauce, and apply this with a brush into the recesses. Although I haven't kept an exact account as to what goes into this mix, it's pretty similar to GW's Magos purple contrast in both colour and behaviour. But if you're interested in mixing up your own ink washes, I'd recommend checking out the Liquitex Muted range and some flow improver from Vallejo. It's a lot cheaper than contrast, but can reactivate if worked over too much. Now, you'll often see my brush go back towards me and not towards the water pot. This is because I'm a dirty paint eater and brush licker. Now, you may be like me, but I totally get it if you prefer cleaning your brush without experiencing the taste of artist grade inks. Although, they're actually quite pleasant compared to scale 75 metallics. Once the purple is dry, I start experimenting with a few different oranges and browns. And although these do provide some nice contrast and subtle staining, I'm looking for something with a little more pop. So, I grab some dirty down rust and work it into the deepest recesses, watering it down directly on the model. And although the effect is pretty nice, I'm still looking for more contrast. Next up, I try a little light rust enamel wash from AK, which, as you can see, is pretty striking, even after a wash down with some thinners. And again, although not bad, it's not quite hitting the spot for me. So I knock it back with a little of the Vallejo rust wash that I tried before. All of this back and forth has inadvertently created some nice subtle weathering, but I still want something that really pops. Time to try some verdigris. I grab a few turquoise and green paints from the rack. Starting with Vallejo's blue-green, I thin this down with some airbrush flow improver and a little water. The addition of the flow improver should help it seek the recesses and keep it from staining the flat areas. Even so, I apply it accurately to the deepest recesses where I think that the water would gather and drip. Although initially quite stark, I know that once it dries, it won't look anywhere near as bright. But still, to give it a little extra colour variation, I grab another paint mix that I commonly use. This time, it's a vibrant green mixed with some flow improver and thinner. I apply this similarly to the previous blue-green. And finally, I use some verdigris glaze from Vallejo very sparingly in some of the deepest recesses just to really push that contrast. Relatively happy with the results, I now give everything a solid coat of ultramatte from AK to knock the shine off the piece. I do this so the room lighting doesn't confuse the lighting already applied with the paint, but also because I really enjoy very flat matte paint jobs. This is very much personal preference, so you do you. There we have it, a red armour panel suitable for all sorts of applications, from terrain, vehicles or even infantry, or maybe even some big stompy robots. Like I mentioned in the intro, this is not meant to be a strict recipe. It's very much more intended to demonstrate the process in coming up with one, or at least a process that you can reproduce later on down the road. I very much want to illustrate that you don't really need a recipe if you don't want one, and you can adapt as you go. Experimenting is a great way to try new materials and techniques. If you don't like it, you can always paint over it and try something different. But as always, I hope you found this helpful and somewhat entertaining. I know that tutorials can sometimes be a little bit dry, but let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, subscribe, share, and all of that good stuff. Until next time, bye!